Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. I too rise to address the Defence Veterans and Families Acute Support Package Bill of 2022. This bill, as has been stated, was originally brought in by the former government, but it is in response in large part by both the current government and former government to an inquiry that was undertaken by the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee, which issued a report in 2017 called The Constant Battle, Suicide by Veterans. That report made 24 recommendations after a fairly extensive period of engaging with veterans and particularly families around the nation and hearing about the various aspects of interaction with the military, but particularly post-military life, and some of the frustrations with the different legislation, the bureaucracy, the lack of resources that had a significant impact on the mental health of veterans. I'd like to just talk a little about some of the background of some of these measures because it highlights the role that individuals have played in bringing about change and highlights that our parliamentary democracy does work. First off, the chair of that committee was the late Senator Alex Gallagher, and Senator Gallagher did a power of work in this area, and it's a highlight of how the different political parties in this place, including the crossbench, can work very constructively on issues that are of national significance. And it's not the impression the Australian public often have, but the reality is, in some of these areas, this work is very constructive. And so I thank Alex for his leadership of that committee. I just want to also touch very briefly on some of the statements in the chair's forward to this report. And I quote, "For modern veterans, it's likely that suicide and self-harm will cause more deaths and injuries for their contemporaries than overseas operational service." That's a pretty stark observation of the situation facing some people. It does go on to say, however, in the forward, and I quote, "It's also important to recognise that the majority of ADF members will leave their service enriched by the experience, will go on to be successful in their civilian endeavours. The members of the ADF receive some of the best training in the world and leave the service with valuable skills and experience that can be transferred to benefit Australian society in a broad field of endeavours. Veterans are an essential part of the fabric of our society, and the inquiry has highlighted that a number of persons with military experience are contributing in politics, business, health services, public service, charities and civil society. Not all the examples provided to the committee have been negative ones. There have been many instances of veterans pulled back from the brink by partners, friends, advocates, health professionals, and DVA clients have expressed their attitude with the assistance they have received from DVA and other agencies." End quote. And so I think it's important to highlight that because often when we talk on these issues, people will get the sense that to be part of the military and all it does for Australia is overwhelmingly negative, whereas that is not necessarily the case. And I certainly speak from experience, having had over 20 years in the regular army and another period in the active reserve. And I believe that it has provided a fantastic foundation for many of the things that I have subsequently undertaken in this place and beyond. But for those in the veteran space, the last part I'd like to quote from this forward, which goes to the two pieces of legislation we're considering today, is a paragraph that says, and I quote, "A unique aspect of this inquiry has been examining the framework of military compensation arrangements and their administration through the lens of the issue of suicide by veterans, and this focus has highlighted the burden of legislative complexity and administrative hurdles on veterans who are often seeking support at a vulnerable period of their lives." End quote. And I would add to that that often those hurdles exist for the families of veterans as well as veterans themselves, which brings me to this bill. As has been outlined by my colleagues, this bill seeks to implement some of the recommendations of that Senate report, particularly around harmonisation of those three pieces of legislation, but also remove some of the hurdles that have faced people And the warlike service is an example where for many years you had to have actually served in a war or warlike service, whereas we see some veterans and their families who are facing significant issues because of accidents and issues that occur during training and in peacetime. And in South Australia just recently, a veteran, Mr Darren Harvey, led an effort to get recognition for veterans who were training at Singleton nearly 30 years ago. And he, along with his fellow recruits, were on a range at Singleton, kicked a grenade which was unexploded, and it exploded and resulted in him being in hospital for an extended period of time and still having issues with the physical issues of that. Thankfully, the Army has, after 30 years, actually provided a recognition to those recruits for their service. But it indicates that there are people who haven't necessarily conducted warlike service who have received injuries and do need the support of the government. Specifically, this bill responds to recommendation 19 of the report, and it's around the ways to support families. And it includes, amongst other things, expanding the eligibility of those who can receive support. Importantly, it says that also the bill ensures that payments for veterans and their families are exempt from income tax and are not included as income for the purposes of social security determinations, and that has been a bugbear for veterans for many years. But to the point I made at the start, I'd just like to highlight that the parliamentary process works, in that representative democracy works. And I'd like to highlight here particularly the role of Ms Ellen Gillespie, a lady from South Australia, who brought to our attention the fact that the current rules and guidelines which were in place meant that you could be the spouse of a veteran, you could support that veteran for decades, giving up career, travelling, moving, nursing, supporting through post-traumatic stress and a whole range of issues. But then, if that relationship broke down and the spouse was now perhaps at the end of the age where they could be working, the veteran would have moved on to continue having the support of the community, but the spouse would be left with little or no superannuation, no entitlement to the benefits that came from being someone who had supported a veteran for all those years, and particularly exacerbated if there was domestic violence involved in the breakup of that relationship. And so her advocacy, her willingness to talk about her story has brought about changes that have already been put in place, and I thank in particular the Deputy Commissioner of DVA, Ms Janice Silby in South Australia, who engaged and listened and brought Ms Gillespie into various opportunities to explain so that the bureaucracy can understand the situation of what is a relatively small group, but a group that we all the same should be looking after. And I'm pleased to see that this bill recognises that the eligibility be expanded to members of working-age veterans who are at risk of or in crisis, along with working-age widowed partners of deceased veterans and former partners under certain circumstances. And so I wish to thank Ellen for her courage in speaking up. I thank her for her care for her former partner over all those years. But I also just want to highlight that our parliamentary democracy works. Our representative democracy works, and this is a good example of it. And so I am pleased to lend my support to this bill today.